The noise started at 6:42 in the morning, a low, guttural chugging, like a sick dragon clearing its throat. It was a sound that did not belong in the quiet tapestry of dawn in our subdivision, a place where the loudest morning sounds were usually the trill of a cardinal or the whisper of sprinklers on manicured lawns. I was on my back porch, a place that had been my sanctuary since my wife Eleanor had passed. The steam from my coffee mug curled into the cool October air, and I watched the world wake up. Or I tried to. The chugging noise was a tear in the fabric of the morning. I stood up, my knees cracking a quiet protest, and walked to the edge of the porch. And then I saw it. Down past the edge of my lawn, where the grass gives way to cattails and wild iris, was my pond. Or what was left of it. A thick, corrugated black hose, at least 8 inches in diameter, snaked from the center of the water, over the bank, and across the narrow strip of common area that separated my property from the street. The hose terminated at a large trailer-mounted industrial pump, painted a garish safety yellow. It was this machine that was making the noise. Muddy water, the lifeblood of my small ecosystem, was being vomited into a storm drain across the street. The water level was already down by at least a foot, exposing a muddy, gasping shoreline that shouldn't be visible until the dry heat of late August. I watched this for a full minute, the coffee growing cold in my hands. It was a violation so direct, so brazen, it took a moment for the logical part of my brain to catch up with the sheer disbelief. This wasn't a neighbor's dog digging under the fence. This was a coordinated, mechanized assault. Then, a car pulled up, a pristine white SUV with an oversized chrome grille that seemed to sneer. A woman emerged from the driver's side. She was dressed not for a Saturday morning, but for a hostile takeover. She wore sharply creased beige trousers, a crisp navy blue blazer with a gaudy pin on the lapel, and sunglasses that were far too large for her face, hiding whatever soul she might have possessed. This was Carol Bradshaw, president of the Northwood Pines Homeowners Association, our queen of petty tyrannies. She strode toward the pump, hands on her hips, surveying the operation like a general reviewing her troops. She saw me standing on my porch. She didn't wave. She marched toward my property line, stopping just short of the ancient moss-covered river stones that marked the boundary. "Mr. Penhaligon," she called out, her voice sharp and carrying easily over the thrum of the pump. "I see you're awake. Good. We should be done here in a few hours." I remained silent. I simply took my phone from my pocket, unlocked it with my thumb, and began recording. I made sure to pan slowly from the pump, along the hose, to the draining pond, and then to her face. Her mouth tightened. "There's no need for that," she snapped. "This is an official HOA action, emergency mosquito abatement. We've had complaints. That stagnant water is a breeding ground for West Nile. It's a health hazard." I still said nothing. I just held the phone steady. This seemed to infuriate her more than any argument could have. "I am the president of this HOA," she declared, puffing out her chest slightly, "and our bylaws give me the authority to act in the interest of community health and safety. This pond is a menace. We're draining it, then we'll be bringing in a crew to fill it. You'll have a lovely, flat, usable lawn space when we're finished. You should be thanking me." I finally lowered the phone but kept it recording by my side. I took a slow sip of my now tepid coffee. I let the silence stretch, forcing her to stand there in the noise and the mess she was creating. "You are on my property," I said. My voice was low, and I didn't bother to raise it. "The pump is on common ground. The hose is on my property. The pond is on my property. You are actively damaging my property." She let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Your property ends at your lawn," she said with absolute certainty, as if stating a law of physics. "This whole swampy mess is a community liability. We have a right to deal with it. If you try to interfere, I will have you fined for obstruction, and I will call the sheriff. Believe me, they know who I am." She tapped the gaudy pin on her blazer. It was a cheap, enameled replica of the HOA logo. This is my authority. I took another sip of coffee. I looked from her smug, confident face to the dying pond, to the muddy water gushing into the drain. I thought about the deeds, the plats, the surveys, the county records, the federal statutes, all resting quietly in a file cabinet in my study. I thought about the years of quiet documentation, the receipts I had kept, the emails I had saved. On paper, her entire world was a fiction. She just didn't know it yet. She mistook my silence for weakness, for the confusion of an old man. "We're doing what's best for everyone," she said, her tone softening into a patronizing coo. "You'll see." She turned her back on me and walked toward the pump, shouting instructions to a man in greasy overalls who was checking a gauge. She had no idea what she had just done. She thought she was draining a puddle. She thought she was asserting her petty authority over a lonely widower. She had no idea she had just declared war on a man who spent 40 years of his life studying water and the laws that govern it. She had no idea she had just trespassed not only on my land, but on ground so heavily protected that her actions could be measured in federal criminal codes. She had no idea she had just buried the only thing keeping her own street from flooding every spring. She had no idea, but before I tell you what I did next, about the certified letters, and the sheriff's deputies, and the emergency board meetings, I should probably explain. I should explain about the pond, and about Carol Bradshaw, and about the thick beige folder in my office labeled simply HOA, because none of this happened in a vacuum. It was the culmination of 5 years of escalating arrogance, and my own quiet, meticulous patience. My name is Arthur Penhaligon. For 42 years I was a hydrologic engineer. It's a term that makes most people's eyes glaze over. In simple terms, I spent my career studying how water moves over and through the earth. My specialty was wetland delineation and remediation. Companies would hire me before they built a subdivision or a shopping mall. I would walk the land, study the soil, the plants, the topography, and I would tell them where the water wanted to go. I would find the swamps, the bogs, the vernal pools, the areas that the law, both natural and man-made, said you could not touch. I drew the lines on the maps that developers hated, the lines that said, "Here, you cannot build." And when they inevitably messed up, built too close or destroyed something they shouldn't have, they'd hire me to figure out how to fix it, how to appease the county, the state, and sometimes the United States Army Corps of Engineers. I dealt with regulations, permits, and belligerent foremen who thought a bulldozer could solve any problem. I learned, very early on, that the most powerful tool in any dispute was not a loud voice, but a certified copy of a recorded plat. Documents were everything. On paper was the only place reality was ever truly settled. My wife Eleanor used to say I had the patience of a glacier. She said I moved slowly, but I reshaped the landscape. After she died, the house became my entire landscape. We bought it 20 years ago, long before the rest of the Northwood Pines subdivision was even a blueprint. It was an older house on a 5-acre lot, the last remnant of an old farm. The main attraction for me, the thing that made me sign the papers, was the pond at the back of the property. The realtor called it a pond. I knew it was a vernal pool, a specific and precious type of seasonal wetland. It filled with the winter rains and spring melt and slowly receded in the summer, but never fully disappeared. It was a hub of life. Spring peepers would create a deafening chorus on April nights. Herons would stalk the shallows. Dragonflies, iridescent jewels, would hunt in the summer sun. Eleanor loved to sit on the porch and watch it. It was our own private piece of wildness. Then the developer came. He bought the surrounding farmland. He saw our 5 acres as a nuisance, an interruption in his grid of cookie-cutter houses. But he couldn't force us to sell. So he built around us. And this is where the trouble began, on paper. To get his development approved, he had to contend with my pond. My little vernal pool, it turned out, was part of a larger watershed system, a critical drainage point for the entire area. The county planners, armed with their own surveys, designated my pond and a 50-foot buffer around it as a conservation easement. That's a legal term. It means that while I still owned the land, its use was permanently restricted. I couldn't build on it, fill it, or significantly alter it. I was its steward, not just its owner. In exchange for the developer getting to build his profitable subdivision, this small piece of nature was to be preserved. It was all there, in the public record, filed with the county clerk, etched onto the master plat of Northwood Pines. My property line was clearly drawn to include the pond and the easement. It was not, and never had been, common ground. For the first few years it was fine. The new neighbors were mostly young families, busy with their lives. The HOA was a sleepy entity that mostly just managed the landscaping for the front entrance. Then, Carol Bradshaw and her husband moved in. They bought one of the largest models, right on the corner. Carol had been, from what I gathered, a mid-level manager at a regional insurance company. She brought that corporate, process-obsessed, and utterly inflexible mindset to the neighborhood. She saw a power vacuum in the HOA, and she filled it with astonishing speed. Her campaign for president was a masterpiece of suburban fear-mongering. She spoke of declining property values, of the need to protect our investment. She used words like standards and enforcement. She won, and her reign began. The first newsletters were full of new rules. Trash cans could not be visible from the street except on collection day. Basketball hoops had to be stored away every evening. Holiday decorations had a strict installation and removal window. The fines started small: $25 for leaving your recycling bin out too long, $50 for a patch of brown grass. I watched from a distance. I paid my dues on time and kept my yard immaculate, but I started a file. Every newsletter, every email blast, every notice of a violation that I received, all went into a simple, beige accordion folder. When I got a $25 fine because a delivery driver had left a package on my porch that was visible from the street, I didn't argue. I wrote a check, made a photocopy of it, and sent it via certified mail with return receipt requested. I filed the check copy, the violation notice, and the green signature card from the post office. I kept the receipts. It was second nature to me. In my old job, documentation was defense. You never knew when you'd need to prove when a specific document was sent or received. Carol's primary targets were the quiet ones, the elderly, the people who wouldn't fight back. Old Mr. Henderson was fined $300 because the paint on his mailbox was peeling. The Garcias, a young couple with 2 toddlers, were hit with weekly fines because their children's plastic slide was visible over their back fence. Carol's power was built on this kind of targeted harassment. She had an architectural review committee that consisted of herself and 2 of her closest friends. They would drive around the neighborhood in a golf cart, clipboards in hand, taking photos and noting infractions. They were a little Politburo on wheels. Her obsession with my pond started about a year before the pump incident. She called it unsightly. In an HOA newsletter, she wrote a passive-aggressive article about the dangers of unmanaged water features and the importance of a uniform, park-like setting for all common areas. This was her first misstep on paper. She was publicly classifying my private property as a common area. I printed the newsletter and put it in my file. So next came the informal suggestions. She'd catch me when I was getting my mail. "Arthur, we should really talk about getting that ditch back there cleaned up." I would just nod and say, "It's a healthy wetland, Carol." She would smile a tight, dismissive smile and change the subject. She had no interest in facts. She had a vision, and my pond was a blot on it. The Mosquito argument was her masterstroke. A child in a neighboring town, miles away, had a suspected case of West Nile virus. It was all over the local news for a week. Carol seized on it. She held an emergency community meeting. I didn't go. I knew it would just be a performance, and I had no interest in being a prop in her play. According to my neighbor Margaret, a timid widow who lived across the street, Carol gave a dramatic, emotional speech about the mortal danger lurking in our midst. She pointed metaphorically at my pond. She called it a stagnant swamp and a public nuisance. She used the word children at least 24 times. She was building her justification, creating a public narrative that would allow her to do whatever she wanted. Margaret told me Carol had claimed she had experts who had confirmed the pond was the source of a mosquito infestation. She had no idea that I was, for all intents and purposes, the foremost expert on that particular body of water in the entire state. The irony was palpable. I just added my notes from my conversation with Margaret to the file. So, when I saw the pump and the hose, and Carol standing there like a conquering hero, I wasn't just surprised. I was, in a strange, detached way, ready. My folder was thick. My knowledge of the land was absolute. My patience, cultivated over a lifetime of watching water slowly find its level, was about to be tested. She thought she was starting a fight. In reality, she was walking into the final, meticulously documented chapter of a story I had been writing for years. She had finally escalated from paper cuts to a full-blown assault, and that changed everything. Back on the porch with the image of Carol's smug face burned into my mind. I finished my recording. I went back inside, set my cold coffee on the counter, and walked into my study. The chugging of the pump was a dull, constant heartbeat in the background. My hands were perfectly steady. There was no anger, not yet. There was only a quiet, cold clarity. A problem had presented itself. It was time to get to work. First, I downloaded the video from my phone to my computer, backed it up on an external hard drive, and uploaded a copy to a private, password-protected cloud server. Digital documentation is fragile. Redundancy is key. I labeled the file with the date and time. 2023-10-0645_Bradshaw_trespass_pump. Next, I opened the beige folder, the Bradshaw file. I spent a few minutes leafing through it. The newsletters, the fine notices, the certified mail receipts, my own typed notes of conversations. It was a 5-year chronicle of petty abuse of power. It established a clear pattern of behavior, of Carol Bradshaw systematically overstepping her authority and targeting residents. This was context. This was motive. Then I began the formal process. The first step was the warning. A direct confrontation was pointless. She had already demonstrated her contempt for my verbal statements. The warning had to be on paper. I drafted a formal cease and desist letter. I didn't use emotional language. I used the language of my profession, precise, factual, and legally grounded. The letter was addressed to Carol Bradshaw in her official capacity as president of the Northwood Pines Homeowners Association and in her personal capacity. That was an important distinction. I wanted to make it clear that I held both the organization and the individual responsible. I cited the specific parcel number of my property, as listed in the county tax records. I referenced the recorded plat map, book number, and page number, where the boundaries are legally defined. I stated unequivocally that the pond and the surrounding 50-foot conservation easement were my private property. I wrote, "Your unauthorized entry onto my property and the installation and operation of a mechanical water pump constitutes criminal trespass under state statute." I cited the specific code. The ongoing removal of water from the vernal pool located on said property constitutes destruction of property. I demanded the immediate cessation of the pumping operation, the removal of all equipment from my land, and a written assurance that no further incursions would occur. I gave her a deadline, 5 p.m. that same day. I printed 2 copies. One I would send to the official HOA mailing address via certified mail, return receipt requested. The other was for immediate delivery. I put it in an envelope, walked out my front door, and drove to the local print shop. I had them fax the letter to the HOA's official fax number, a number listed in their own documents, and I paid the extra $1 for a transmission confirmation sheet. Faxes are dated and timed. They are another form of receipt. Then I drove to Carol's house. Her white SUV was parked in the driveway. I didn't knock. I taped the envelope securely to her front door, right below the peephole. I took a picture of it with my phone, the date and timestamp clearly visible. Another receipt. Her response came less than an hour later. Not as a letter or a phone call, but as an email sent to the entire neighborhood mailing list. The subject line was, "An update on our community safety initiative. Dear neighbors," it began in her typically cheerful, condescending tone. "Our mosquito abatement project is proceeding wonderfully. However, I regret to inform you that one of our residents, Mr. Arthur Penhaligon, is attempting to obstruct this vital work. He has sent threatening letters and is refusing to cooperate with our efforts to protect our children and our property values. Please know that the HOA board is fully behind this project, and we will not be deterred by the selfish actions of one individual. We are exploring all legal options to ensure this safety work is completed. Thank you for your support." She had attached a photo to the email. It was a picture of my letter taped to her door. She had taken my formal, legal warning and turned it into a public spectacle, a piece of propaganda to rally her base. She had no idea how valuable that email was. She had just provided me with a written, time-stamped admission that she had received my warning and had chosen to willfully ignore it. She had also publicly defamed me to the entire community. I saved the email as a PDF and added it to my digital file. 2023-10-114_Bradshaw_defamation_admission. I kept the receipts. It was clear that simple warnings were useless. She was insulated by her own arrogance and the echo chamber of her supporters. I had to escalate. I had to move beyond the language of property lines and into a language that even she would be forced to understand, the language of outside, superior authority. I retreated to my study. It was time to really go to work. I wasn't just a property owner anymore. I was a hydrologic engineer, working a case. My property was the site, Carol was the non-compliant contractor, and the goal was to compile a report so undeniable that any adjudicating body would have no choice but to rule in my favor. My first call was to Ben. Ben Carter had been my protege for the last 10 years of my career. He was a brilliant young surveyor and GIS mapping specialist, now running his own successful firm. "Arthur, good to hear from you. Everything all right?" "Ben, I have a job for you," I said, getting straight to the point. "An urgent one. I need a boundary and topographical survey of my property. I need you to specifically locate and flag the 50-foot conservation easement line as described in the county plat. And I need you to use GPS to pinpoint the exact location of a piece of industrial equipment, a water pump, and the path of its drainage hose." There was a pause. "A water pump? What's going on?" "My HOA president is attempting to drain my pond," I said flatly. Ben let out a low whistle. "The vernal pool? Is she insane? That's the linchpin of the whole surface water management plan for that plat. She believes it is a mosquito-infested swamp on common ground," I replied. "I need your survey to be the first piece of irrefutable evidence to the contrary. I need it notarized, certified, and delivered to me by Monday morning." "Consider it done, Arthur. I'll move some things around. I can be there in 2 hours." My next step was to dig deeper than the county records. The conservation easement was a county-level designation. But I had a nagging memory from when we first bought the house. Something about the original farm and a federal program. I spent the next 3 hours on the county clerk's online records portal, going back not 20 years to the subdivision's creation, but 50 years. I searched for the original farm's parcel number. I cross-referenced it with state environmental protection databases, and then I found it, the bombshell. It was a dusty, scanned document from 1978. A notice of delineation from the United States Army Corps of Engineers, the original farmer, to be eligible for certain agricultural subsidies, had his land assessed. The document included a hand-drawn map, and on that map, a small, kidney bean-shaped area was circled in red pencil. It was labeled JW7B, my pond. The report identified it as a jurisdictional wetland under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. My heart didn't race. It settled. This was the moment, the click of the final heavy tumbler falling into place in a complex lock. This changed the entire game. This was no longer a simple property dispute. This wasn't a matter for the HOA or even the local sheriff. This was a federal issue. A jurisdictional wetland is a legal term of immense power. It means the federal government has authority over that piece of land. To do anything, dredge, fill, divert, or drain, you need a federal permit from the Army Corps of Engineers. The process takes months, sometimes years, and requires extensive environmental impact studies. To do so without a permit is not a finable infraction, it is a federal crime. The penalties were not a few $100s. They were, at the time, up to $50,000 per day of violation, plus potential felony charges for the individuals responsible. Carol Bradshaw, in her quest to eliminate a few mosquitoes, had blundered into one of the most heavily regulated areas of environmental law. She had no idea. She was playing checkers, and she had just tipped over the king on a chessboard she didn't even know existed. I immediately requested a certified copy of the 1978 delineation report and the accompanying map from the state archives. I paid the extra fee for expedited service. Then, I went to the Army Corps of Engineers regional website and downloaded every relevant statute, regulation, and guidance document pertaining to Section 404 violations. I was preparing my final report. On paper, I was building a fortress, and all the while the pump outside chugged on, every revolution digging Carol's hole a little bit deeper. The following morning, Sunday, the chugging was still there. It had become a dull, omnipresent ache in the background of my life. Ben's survey crew had come and gone the day before, planting small wooden stakes with bright orange flags all along the 50-foot easement line. The flags created a stark, undeniable boundary. The pump, the hose, and a significant portion of the muddy exposed pond bed were clearly inside the line. Inside my property, Carol, it seemed, was not impressed by the survey stakes. If anything, they emboldened her. At around 10 a.m., I saw her walking across the common area, followed by a man and a woman from her committee. They stopped at one of Ben's stakes, and Carol kicked it. She actually kicked the survey marker out of the ground. Then she pointed at my house and spoke to her companions, her gestures sharp and angry. She was escalating. She was performing. And I knew what was coming next. The call was predictable. She was confident, wrapped in the armor of her self-proclaimed authority, and she believed the law was a tool for people like her to use against people like me. When my attempts to reason with her via paper had failed, and my clear marking of my own property was met with contempt, she did what all bullies do when their victim doesn't immediately fold. She called a bigger bully, or so she thought. She called the sheriff's department. I saw the patrol car roll slowly down the street about 30 minutes later. It parked behind the yellow pump trailer. Carol was there in an instant, practically vibrating with righteous indignation. She met the deputy as he stepped out of his car, launching into an immediate, high-speed tirade. I watched from my front window. I could see her pointing at my house, then at the half-drained pond, her hands gesturing wildly. It was a masterclass in performative victimhood. The deputy was young. He had a calm, professional demeanor that seemed utterly immune to Carol's theatrics. He listened patiently, nodding occasionally, his hand resting on his duty belt. After several minutes of her uninterrupted monologue, he finally held up a hand to stop her and turned to walk toward my front door. I met him on the porch. I had a small, neat stack of documents ready on the wicker table next to my chair. "Good morning, sir," the deputy said. His name tag read Miller. "I'm Deputy Miller. I'm responding to a call from a Miss Carol Bradshaw regarding a disturbance." "Good morning, deputy," I replied calmly. "There is no disturbance here. There is, however, an ongoing criminal trespass and destruction of private property. I'm Arthur Penhaligon, This is my home." Carol had followed him, and was standing on my lawn, just at the bottom of the porch steps, arms crossed. "He's the one causing the disturbance," she interjected. "He's trying to stop a vital community safety project." Deputy Miller gave her a brief, neutral glance, then turned his attention back to me. "Sir, Miss Bradshaw asserts that this pond area is HOA common ground, and that they are within their rights to drain it for mosquito control. What's your side of the story?" This was the moment. This was the official record. His body camera was on. Everything said now was evidence. I did not raise my voice. I did not engage with Carol's accusations. I simply picked up the stack of papers from the table. "Deputy," I began, "I will show you 3 documents. First, this is a certified copy of my property deed, filed with the county clerk on May 12, 2003. You can see the parcel description here." I pointed to the paragraph. "It legally describes the boundaries of my 5-acre lot." I placed the deed on top of the stack and picked up the next sheet. "Second, this is a copy of the official master plat for the Northwood Pines subdivision, also on file with the county. My property is clearly outlined here as Lot 1. As you can see, the property line, indicated here, I traced it with my finger, fully encompasses the body of water in question. It is not, and has never been, designated as a common area." Deputy Miller took the plat map and studied it for a long moment. He looked up from the paper, his eyes scanning the yard, the pond, the survey stakes, and Carol. His expression didn't change, but I saw a flicker of understanding. He was processing the difference between her loud assertions and my quiet facts. "And third," I said, picking up the final document, "this is a certified boundary survey completed yesterday by a licensed state surveyor." I handed him the large folded sheet. "It confirms the boundaries shown on the deed and the plat. It uses GPS coordinates to show that the pump, the hose, and the crew she hired are all operating well within my property lines. The orange flags you see out there mark the easement line, which is also on my property." I paused, letting him absorb the information. "Deputy Miller, Miss Bradshaw was formally notified yesterday, in writing and by fax, that she was trespassing. She has continued the operation. I would like to file an official report for criminal trespass and felony destruction of property, given the value of the remediation that will now be required." I made sure to use the specific legal terms. I was not making a complaint. I was making a formal accusation based on documented evidence. The deputy folded the survey and handed the documents back to me. He turned to Carol. His tone was still professional, but the neutrality was gone. It had been replaced by a weary firmness. "Ma'am," he said, "based on the documents Mr. Penhaligon has provided, this appears to be his private property. You and your crew do not have the legal right to be here or to operate this equipment on his land." Carol's face went through a rapid series of emotions: disbelief, outrage, then sputtering fury. "What? Did he pay you? This is ridiculous. I am the HOA president. Our bylaws—" "Ma'am," Deputy Miller cut her off, his voice a little sharper this time. "Your HOA bylaws do not supersede state law or recorded property deeds. Right now, this is a civil matter. However, if you refuse to leave his property, it will become a criminal one. You need to have your workers shut down that pump and remove all of their equipment from Mr. Penhaligon's land immediately." "This is an outrage," she hissed. "I will be calling your supervisor. I will be calling the county commissioner." "You are welcome to do that, ma'am," the deputy said, his patience clearly wearing thin. "But in the meantime, you will love this property." Now, defeated but still radiating malice, Carol spun around and marched toward the pump crew, shouting for them to shut it down. The glorious, guttural chugging that had been the soundtrack to my weekend finally sputtered and died. The silence that followed was beautiful. Deputy Miller turned back to me. "I'm going to need to take your full statement, sir, and I'll need your name and date of birth." "Of course, Deputy," I said, "and for the record, I want to be perfectly clear in my statement. I am requesting that the District Attorney's Office review this case for potential prosecution." I have video evidence of the initial trespass, as well as copies of all correspondence." He nodded slowly, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "I'll be sure to put that in the report, Mr. Penhaligon. Every word." He took out his notepad. As I gave my statement, I knew the body camera was capturing the entire exchange, capturing the survey flags, the half-drained pond, the silent pump. It was all being entered into the official record. Another set of receipts. Carol thought calling the authorities was her ultimate weapon. She had no idea she had just arranged for an impartial, armed witness to officially document her own crimes. The departure of the deputy and the pump crew did not bring peace. It brought a different kind of quiet, a tense, simmering silence. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. I knew Carol Bradshaw. This public humiliation would not make her reconsider. It would make her double down. Her power was based on an illusion of absolute authority. I had punctured that illusion with a few pieces of paper in front of an agent of the state. She would have to strike back. And it would be vicious. The first sign that the ground was shifting came that evening, a tentative knock on my front door. It was Margaret, my neighbor from across the street. She was a small, bird-like woman, in her late 70s, clutching a Tupperware container of what smelled like banana bread. In the 5 years since Carol's reign began, our interactions had been limited to polite waves. Fear was a powerful insulator. "Arthur," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "I saw the sheriff's car. I saw them take the pump away. I just wanted to say thank you." "There's nothing to thank me for, Margaret. I was just protecting my property." "No," she insisted, looking over her shoulder as if Carol might materialize from the shadows. "You did what none of the rest of us had the courage to do. You stood up to her." She pushed the container into my hands. "This is for you, but also, I might have something else." She pulled a small USB flash drive from her cardigan pocket. "I've been on the social committee for 3 years," she whispered. "I take minutes at all the board meetings, official and unofficial." She glanced nervously around again. "Carol has a habit of holding pre-meetings with her friends on the board. She turns the recorder off for the official minutes, but my phone is always on in my purse. I have recordings of her telling the board to ignore the HOA's own lawyer when he told her she couldn't find the Garcias for their playset. I have her on tape calling Mr. Henderson a senile old goat and saying they should fine him until he moves. And I have the audio from last week's emergency meeting, where she lied about consulting with environmental experts about your pond." I looked down at the small piece of plastic in her hand. It was a digital treasure trove of malice and malfeasance. "Margaret," I said slowly, "this is incredibly brave of you." "She fined me $200 last spring because my wind chimes were producing a nuisance noise," she said, a flash of steel in her eyes. "My late husband gave me those chimes. I was too scared to fight then. I'm not scared anymore." The second crack in Carol's fortress appeared the next morning, in the form of an email from an anonymous address. "You don't know me," it read, "but my name is David Chen. I am the treasurer of the HOA. I am writing to you because I cannot be a party to this any longer. Carol Bradshaw approved the rental of that pump and hired the work crew without a board vote. She classified it as an emergency safety expenditure to bypass the normal approval process, which requires 3 bids for any project over $5,000. The total cost was nearly $12,000, drawn directly from our reserve fund. I have the invoices. I have the emails where I questioned her authority, and she told me to just process the payment and stay in my lane. I cannot sit by while she bankrupts the HOA and exposes us all to this liability. If you are planning to take formal action, I will testify." The fearful ally and the disillusioned insider, the 2 archetypes of every coup. Margaret and David had been silenced by fear and procedure, but my quiet resistance had given them an anchor. My folder was no longer just mine. It was becoming a community archive, a repository of collective grievance. The coalition was forming. I spent the rest of Monday coordinating. I hired a lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Miss Albright, who specialized in property and contract law. I didn't need a bulldog. I needed a procedural expert. I forwarded her the entire digital file, my videos, the letters, the sheriff's report number, Margaret's audio files, and David's documents. She was ecstatic. "Mr. Penhaligon," she said over the phone, "this is the most well-documented case of HOA overreach I have ever seen. It's an absolute gift." We decided on a two-pronged approach. First, she would draft a formal demand letter to the HOA board, copying each member individually, outlining the trespass, the potential liability for the destruction of the wetland, and the financial malfeasance regarding the unapproved expenditure. The letter would demand a full, public retraction of Carol's defamatory statements and a formal proposal for the remediation of the pond, to be paid for by the HOA. Second, and this was my contribution, I made a phone call. I looked up the number for the Regional Enforcement Office of the United States Army Corps of Engineers. I reported a potential violation of Section 404 of the Clean Water Act at my address, parcel number and all. I gave them a brief, dispassionate summary of the events: the unauthorized draining of a previously delineated jurisdictional wetland. I gave them Carol Bradshaw's name as the responsible party. The man on the other end of the line was quiet for a moment. Then, he said, "Thank you for the report, sir. An agent will be in contact. We take this type of violation very seriously." The trap was now fully set. All that was left was for the target to make her final, fatal move. It came on Tuesday afternoon, delivered by a courier, a thick, official-looking envelope. It was a notice from the HOA. Carol was making her last desperate play. She had convened a special executive disciplinary hearing for the following evening. The notice was a work of art in its audacity. It accused me of conduct detrimental to the community, willful obstruction of a board-approved safety initiative, creation of a public health nuisance, and harassment of board members and contractors. The proposed penalty was breathtaking in its scope: a $50,000 fine, a permanent lien on my property, and a demand that I pay the $12,000 bill for the pump and crew that I had forced to stop their work. She was trying to crush me under a mountain of fabricated debt. The notice stated that the hearing would allow me to present my case, but the verdict was a foregone conclusion in her mind. This wasn't a hearing. It was a show trial. It was meant to be the public execution of my reputation and my finances, a warning to anyone else who might dare to defy her. I scanned the notice and emailed it to Ms. Albright. Her reply was succinct. "Perfect. They've just handed us the ideal venue for our presentation. Let them build the stage. We'll provide the final act." She had no idea. She had called a meeting to sentence me, but she had actually scheduled her own reckoning. The public forum she intended for my humiliation was about to become the theater of her undoing. And I had all the scripts. The community clubhouse was packed. The air was thick with a mixture of cheap air freshener and palpable tension. Carol had made sure to fill the front rows with her loyalists, the members of her committees, the neighbors who benefited from her favor, the ones who enjoyed the vicarious thrill of her power. They sat with smug, expectant looks on their faces. Behind them, scattered throughout the room, were the others, the quiet ones. Mr. Henderson was there, looking frail but resolute. The Garcia couple sat near the back, their faces nervous but hopeful. Margaret sat right behind me, a silent pillar of support. David Chen, the treasurer, was seated at the board table, looking pale but determined. He avoided looking at Carol. I sat in the single chair placed in the middle of the room, facing the long table where the 5 board members sat. In the center, of course, was Carol Bradshaw, in her full presidential regalia. She held a gavel in her hand like a scepter. To my left, Ms. Albright sat calmly, a single, slim, leather portfolio on her lap. I had my own folder, the beige one, resting on my knees. It felt warm, like a living thing. Carol banged the gavel. "This special executive disciplinary hearing of the Northwood Pines Homeowners Association is now in session," she announced, her voice resonating with forced solemnity. "We are here tonight to address the serious matter of rule violations by resident Arthur Penhaligon, She began her performance. It was exactly what I expected. She started with a quiver in her voice, playing the part of the reluctant, heavy-hearted leader forced to take unpleasant action for the greater good. She spoke of her sleepless nights, worrying about the safety of the neighborhood's children. She held up photos of mosquitoes, enlarged to terrifying proportions on a projector screen. "This is what we are fighting against," she said, her voice rising with passion. "A menace that threatens our families. And when your board took decisive necessary action to remove a known breeding ground for these pests, a stagnant, fetid swamp that has been an eyesore for years, we were met with hostility, with threats, with obstruction." She paced in front of the table, a practiced move. "Mr. Penhaligon, a man who has lived here for years, chose to place his own selfish desires above the health and safety of this entire community, and he called the authorities to stop our work. He has cost this association thousands of dollars, and he has insulted and harassed your volunteer board members." Tears started to well in her eyes. It was a masterful touch. We cannot allow one person's selfishness to endanger us all. We cannot allow our rules, the very rules that protect our property values and our way of life, to be trampled upon. She returned to her seat, dabbing her eyes with the tissue. "Therefore, the board proposes the following sanctions, in accordance with Article 9 of our bylaws: a fine of $50,000 for creating a hazardous nuisance and obstructing the board, a lien to be placed on his property to ensure payment, and full restitution to the association for all costs incurred in the aborted abatement project, totaling $12,157. A murmur went through the room. The amount was shocking, designed to be. Carol let the number hang in the air. A death sentence. "Mr. Penhaligon," she said, her voice now cold and hard, the performance over, "you may now speak. Though I can't imagine what you could possibly have to say." I stood up slowly. I did not look at Carol. I looked at the faces in the crowd. I looked at Mr. Henderson, at the Garcias. Then I turned to the board. Missy Albright gave me a slight nod. "My name is Arthur Penhaligon," I began, my voice even and calm. "I am not here to debate the value of community safety. I am here to present facts. Unlike Miss Bradshaw, I will not be presenting opinions or fears. I will be presenting documents. Everything I am about to say is a matter of public record." I opened my beige folder. "Fact number 1, the property in question is mine." I walked to the table and placed a document in front of each board member. "This is my certified deed, and this," I added, placing a second document on top of the first, "is the official, notarized survey I had conducted last Saturday. As you can plainly see, the pond is located entirely within the boundaries of my private property. The HOA has no more legal authority over it than it does over the contents of my living room." I let them look at the papers. David Chen picked his up and studied it intently. The other board members glanced at them nervously, then at Carol. "Fact number 2, I continued, my voice unchanging. "The HOA board, as a governing body, never approved this action." I looked directly at David Chen. "Mr. Chen, as treasurer, were you present for a vote to approve an expenditure of over $12,000 for a mosquito abatement project?" David cleared his throat. All eyes were on him. "No," he said, his voice shaking slightly but clear. "There was no vote. President Bradshaw authorized the payment herself, claiming it was an emergency." Gasps from the crowd. This was the first crack in the public facade. Carol shot David a look of pure venom. "That was within my rights as president in an emergency," she snapped. "An emergency you fabricated," I said coolly, not missing a beat. "Which brings me to fact number 3. This was not an HOA action. This was a personal vendetta, executed with HOA funds." I turned to Margaret. "Margaret, would you be willing to share what you told me about the board meetings?" Margaret stood up, clutching her purse. "Carol has been trying to get rid of that pond for years," she said, her voice surprisingly strong. "She called it an eyesore. The mosquito thing only came up after the story on the news. She never consulted any experts. She said in a pre-meeting, and I have it on tape, 'We just need a good excuse to finally get rid of that swamp.'" The room erupted in murmurs. Carol was banging her gavel. "This is out of order. This is hearsay from a disgruntled resident." "It's not hearsay when it's recorded, Carol," I said, my voice cutting through the noise. I held up a small digital audio player. And we have the recordings. Carol's face went pale. The confident smirk was gone, replaced by a tight, panicked mask. She had no idea. Then came the final act. The revelation I had saved for last. But all of this, I said, gesturing to the papers, the recorder, the property lines, the financial misconduct, the lies. It's all secondary, it's the small picture. Now I would like to talk about the big picture. I paused, letting the room fall silent. You see, that body of water is not a pond. It's not a swamp. On paper, I said, drawing out the words. In the official records of the United States government, it has a name. It is designated Jurisdictional Wetlands 7B, under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act of 1972. I placed the final document on the table in front of Carol. It was the certified copy of the 1978 Army Corps of Engineers Delineation Report, with the map showing the red circle around my pond. That's a federal designation, I explained, my voice echoing in the stunned silence. It means that the United States government has jurisdiction over that land. To alter it in any way, to dredge it, to fill it, or to drain it as you did, requires a federal permit from the Army Corps of Engineers. The penalty for performing that work without a permit, as you did, is not an HOA fine. It is a federal civil penalty of, as of this year, up to $57,587 per day. I let that number sink in. The pump ran for approximately 38 hours. That is 2 days of violation. That is a potential fine levied against the responsible parties of $115,174. Furthermore, a willful violation of the Clean Water Act can be prosecuted as a federal felony, carrying with it the possibility of prison time. The collapse was total. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was a quiet, internal implosion. The color drained completely from Carol Bradshaw's face. Her mouth hung slightly open. The mask didn't just drop. It shattered. For the first time she looked small. The bravado, the confidence, the sheer, unshakable certainty that had defined her was gone, replaced by the blank, hollow look of someone who has just realized they have made a catastrophic, life-altering miscalculation. She stared at the federal document as if it were a poisonous snake. I turned to the rest of the board. I have already filed a formal report with the Regional Enforcement Office of the Army Corps of Engineers. They are opening an investigation. The HOA, as the entity that paid for the work, will be named, and Carol Bradshaw, as the individual who ordered and directed the work without a board vote, will be named personally. I looked out at the assembled homeowners. Your president, in her reckless obsession, has not protected your property values. She has exposed every single one of you to catastrophic financial liability. My lawyer will be in contact with the board tomorrow to discuss the costs of remediating the damage to the wetland, but the federal fines, that will be between this association and the United States government. I picked up my empty folder. I believe this hearing is concluded. I turned and walked out of the clubhouse. Miss Albright followed, a thin, satisfied smile on her face. Behind us there was no applause. There was only the dead, profound silence of a reign that had just come to an end. The aftermath was swift and brutal, a controlled demolition of Carol Bradshaw's world. The public confrontation at the clubhouse had been the detonation, and the days that followed were the collapse of the structure. It all happened on paper, through emails and legal notices, which felt appropriate. The first consequence was the immediate implosion of the HOA board. The day after the hearing, David Chen and 2 other board members formally submitted their resignations, stating they could not serve under a president who had exposed the association to such extreme legal and financial peril. This left Carol and her one remaining crony without a quorum, paralyzing their ability to take any official action. A petition for a special election to recall Carol and elect a new board was circulated, and it gained the necessary signatures in less than 24 hours. The vote, held a week later, was a landslide. Carol was recalled, and David Chen was elected as the new interim president, tasked with the monumental job of cleaning up the mess. The second consequence was legal. Ms. Albright, my lawyer, sent her demand letter. It was a masterpiece of legal precision. It detailed the trespass, the property damage, the financial malfeasance, and the defamation. It included a preliminary estimate for the wetland remediation from an environmental consulting firm I trusted. The cost to restore the pond's ecosystem, to repair the banks, reintroduce native vegetation, and monitor the water quality until it stabilized, was estimated at $32,000. The letter made it clear that we held the HOA responsible for this cost. The HOA's insurance carrier, upon being notified of the claim and the circumstances, took one look at the situation and immediately sent a reservation of rights letter. This is the insurance world's way of saying, we might cover this, but we're pretty sure your president's actions were intentional and possibly criminal, which would void your coverage. They launched their own investigation, which put even more pressure on the beleaguered association. David Chen, in his first act as president, hired an outside law firm to represent the HOA. Their first piece of advice was to settle with me immediately, and then pursue legal action against Carol personally to recoup the damages. The concept of the corporate veil protects board members who act in good faith. Carol had not acted in good faith. She had acted with willful negligence and malice, and the evidence, Margaret's recordings, David's emails, the public record, was overwhelming. The third and most significant consequence was federal. 2 weeks after my call, an agent from the Army Corps of Engineers visited my property. He was a quiet, serious man in his 50s with a deep knowledge of environmental law. He walked the perimeter of the pond, took soil and water samples, and reviewed my entire file of documents. He confirmed that it was, indeed, a jurisdictional wetland and that a major violation had occurred. He informed me that his office would be pursuing enforcement action. The final verdict from the federal government came down 6 months later. The HOA, as the entity that funded the illegal action, was fined $25,000. However, the bulk of the penalty was levied directly at Carol Bradshaw. Citing the evidence that she had acted unilaterally and deliberately misled the board, the final order assessed a personal civil penalty of $75,000 against her. She was also required to pay for the full cost of the remediation of my pond. Faced with financial ruin, she and her husband put their house up for sale. It sold quickly, and they were gone. I never saw her again. With Carol gone, a sense of quiet normalcy, of breathable air, returned to the neighborhood. The new HOA board, under David's leadership, was a study in sober responsibility. Their first official act was to formally apologize to me, in writing, and to the community at large. They agreed to pay for the remediation using funds from a special assessment that was, ironically, levied against all homeowners. It was a bitter but necessary pill for the community to swallow. A tangible cost for their years of passive acceptance of Carol's tyranny. The board then undertook a complete overhaul of the bylaws. All of Carol's petty, vindictive rules were rescinded. The fine schedules were revised to be reasonable and focused on genuine issues of safety and maintenance, not aesthetic control. They even voted to refund all the fines that had been levied by Carol's Architectural Review Committee over the past 2 years. Mr. Henderson got his $300 back for the peeling mailbox. The Garcias received a check for over $1,000 and a letter apologizing for the harassment they had endured over their children's playset. Community began to heal. Neighbors started talking to each other again, not in whispered complaints about the HOA, but in friendly conversations over fences. Margaret's wind chimes, which she had taken down in fear, were rehung, and their gentle music returned to the street. She and I developed a quiet friendship, often sharing a cup of tea on my porch, watching the pond slowly come back to life. The remediation crew had done their work, and the native plants were taking root. The spring peepers returned, their chorus louder and more defiant than ever. One afternoon, about a year after it all began, I was sitting on my porch. The pond was full, its surface reflecting the blue sky. A great blue heron, elegant and patient, stood motionless in the shallows, hunting. It was a scene of perfect, hard-won peace. My beige folder sat on the table beside me. It was thicker now, containing the settlement agreement, the letters from the new board, and a copy of the final order from the Army Corps of Engineers. It was a complete story. I thought about the nature of things. I thought about ownership. I owned the land, the deed said so. But in a deeper sense I was merely its custodian. The pond belonged to the water, to the birds, to the intricate web of life it supported. Carol had thought ownership meant control, the right to impose one's will. She believed her title of president gave her power, but her power was a performance, a fragile illusion built on confidence and fear. It couldn't withstand the quiet, unyielding force of a documented fact. My power, if you could call it that, came from a different place. It came from understanding the rules, not just the petty rules of an HOA, but the deeper, more fundamental rules of watersheds, of legal precedent, of federal statutes. It came from patience, from observation, and from the meticulous habit of keeping receipts. Eleanor used to joke that my love of paperwork was a character flaw, but in the end, it was the paper that had saved the pond, the plat map, the deed, the survey, the 70-year-old federal report. They were more powerful than any gavel or any angry speech. They were the truth, written down and recorded. I picked up a small, framed object from the table. It was a gift from Ben, the surveyor. He had taken one of the original wooden survey stakes, the ones Carol had kicked, and mounted it in a shadow box. Next to it, he had printed a small brass plaque. It didn't say anything triumphant. It just had a set of coordinates, the precise GPS location of the corner of my property line, the point where the violation had begun. It was a symbol of a line that had been crossed, and then, with great and deliberate effort, firmly re-established. It was a reminder that order, once disturbed, can be restored. You just need to know where the lines are drawn, on paper.